that serious. No, we should do that. I'll split it 50-50.
Is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are a part of our virtual audience, please email dolequestions@ku.edu with any questions. The Dole Institute mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. I would also like to announce that we will be having a book program about women veterans in American politics on November 15 at 2 p.m. More details can be found on our website, doleinstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming Director Dr. Cotter.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be back here in the football capital of Kansas now. And I'd like to welcome everybody to basically iteration 9 of our Periphery of War series here at the Dole Institute of Politics in collaboration with the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College. Today I have the honor of introducing Dr. Gates Brown, who's a member of our faculty. He's an associate professor. He took his degree right here at KU, his PhD. He served in the Army from 2004 to 2011 and earned both the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star in Iraq. He recently published Eisenhower's Nuclear Calculus in Europe and is currently working on a book on Eisenhower and his relation with the Korean War, which makes him eminently qualified to discuss today's topic, which is the implications of the Korean War on U.S. policy. And so will you join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Gates Brown.
Thank you, Dr. Cotter. So when we think about the Korean War, we often discuss it as the forgotten war. And that's true because it's awkwardly placed between World War II and the Vietnam War. World War II is something that is much closer to what war should be in our national memory and our national conversation about war. You've got a much broader consensus behind the war effort. There's clear understanding of what the policy end that the war seeks, and it's pretty clear that the war achieves its policy goal. Vietnam is also a conflict that resonates in our national memory, but almost for the opposite reasons, in that over the course of the war it becomes increasingly unpopular, and the mass movement is not in support of the war, but against it. The policy end goals that the war tries to achieve evolve and become more and more distasteful to the American population. And then there's the Korean War. It kind of has elements of both of those. There's not a broad anti-war movement, but there's increasing frustration with the war. There's an evolution of policy, but its end doesn't fit how we talk about war termination. There's a ceasefire, there's an armistice, but it's not any type of end to the war because it continues in some aspects to today. And so when we talk about this as forgotten war, it's forgotten, but more in the sense of the fact that fish kind of forget they're wet, right? They don't know that they're wet, and that's the Korean War for us today. One of the things we're going to investigate is how does the Korean War shape not only the Cold War, but the world that we live in. And to look at that, we're going to talk about the domestic implications, the foreign policy implications. But before we can get to those, we have to set the stage. What was the war like, the world like before the war? And oftentimes we collapse the beginning of the Cold War with the end of World War II, as if one immediately follows the other. And that's not quite true. Between 1945 and 1950, there's an evolution of U.S. policy. And it's interesting because there's a lot of muddy or muddled thinking about what are the threats, what's the best way to respond to those threats. And if you look at this picture here on your left, you've got Uncle Sam who is tentatively navigating this log bridge, and he's holding a bag of money. That's aid to Greece and Turkey. And this is the Truman Doctrine. You've got communist incursion, communist-funded and supported insurgencies in Greece and Turkey. And the response from the Truman administration is money, some material, but definitely not combat troops. And on the other side, we've got Henry Wallace, who is building an awkward platform. He's going to be the progressive candidate for the presidential election in 1948. He doesn't win, but what's interesting about those flags, abandon the Marshall Plan, abandon atom bomb manufacture, and abandon the Truman Doctrine, and you've got John Q. Public there in the bottom corner, so we abandon hope as well. It shows that there are a lot of efforts that the Truman administration's trying to leverage to address this evolving Soviet threat. The Marshall Plan is an attempt to show that capitalism can provide for the economies in Central and Western Europe, because there's real concern that France or Italy could elect communists into their legislatures. And once that happens, then they may go the way of Eastern Europe, where you have elections ostensibly to select governments, but once a communist party takes hold of a government, there's no loyal opposition, there's no chance to wrest it back. And so you've got to do something to show that capitalism can be successful. You also have the nuclear monopoly. The United States is the only power with atomic weapons. And this seems to cure a whole lot of security questions, as long as that holds true. And the hope is that that'll hold true into the early part of the 1950s. Of course, we know that that's not going to be the case. But from 45 to about 48, there's different understandings of the type of threat and how to address that threat. And it's best capsulated, best described by George Kennan, who's going to articulate the containment policy that the Truman administration adopts. And his view is that there are strong points, that there are more important areas of the world than others. Japan, the Rural River Valley, and the United Kingdom. Those are the strong points that the United States needs to maintain access to and trade with in order to come out on top in this economic and political contest. Kennan's very skeptical of the idea of militarizing containment, because he worries that if you become too aggressive, you're going to invite the very conflict you don't want, which is a militarized conflict with the Soviet Union. And so better to keep it in the realm of economics, better to keep it in the realm of politics or ideology, instead of making it overtly about military capacity. And we see the Truman administration going along those lines with rapid demobilization after World War II, which is bipartisan. There aren't that many folks outside of uniformed leaders really haranguing the administration to keep a large number of folks in uniform. And part of that is economic. There's not a sense that the U.S. economy can support both war manufacturing and consumer manufacturing, that you really do have to make a decision. And after World War II, when you really concentrated on defense production, now it's time to get back to consumer production. That's what the United States really should be doing. And it also goes back to this historic dichotomy that the United States has when it comes to war and peace, that there's a clear dividing line. And once you're at war, well, that's what you do. You fight a war. And then when the war ends, now it's something else. Let's get back to peacetime. And the peacetime military in the United States is generally a shell of whatever is needed for a war. Things get awkward, though, in 1948 and 1949. This is when the Cold War, in its early stages, starts to take on a little bit more of a militaristic or aggressive overtone. In 1948, the Soviets are going to use force to support a coup in Czechoslovakia. So now you see the Red Army, although generally assessed as weak, but the Soviets are willing to use conventional military power to enforce communist rule in places where it should be left open to the people. And then in 1949, you have two events that are pretty significant. One immediately more significant for the Truman administration, and the other is going to become more of a problem as we get into the McCarthy era. The first one is the Soviet detonation of an atomic bomb. Now, nobody thinks that the U.S. atomic monopoly is going to last forever. But the hope is it can get you into the 1950s, and by then maybe you'll have a better answer about how to deal with this atomic arms race. But it happens in 1949. And that's going to cause the Truman administration to reassess where they are as far as their security policy. In the latter part of 1949, the nationalists are going to lose the Chinese Civil War and get pushed off the mainland. And we'll see how that's not necessarily a catalyst, but it's going to be something that's more important when China enters the Korean War, as far as understanding what is the character of this communist threat. So at the end of 1949, the Truman administration starts to review their national security policy. George Kennan's out by this time. A guy named Paul Nitze is leading the think tank inside the State Department that's responsible for coming up with these new documents. And what he's going to focus on is something that's different from strong point containment. It's going to be perimeter containment. That you actually need to hem in the Soviets everywhere. Different from Kennan, who argue there are peripheral areas. And if these peripheral areas change hands, that's really not an existential threat. However, if Japan, the Ruhr River Valley, or the United Kingdom, if those regions are up for grabs, that is something the U.S. can't allow. Another thing that Nitze is going to argue, in contrast to Kennan, is that this is really about not just atomic deterrence, but also conventional deterrence. And the United States had let that capability atrophy. And so you need to redouble your investment not only to build thermonuclear weapons, but also to build a conventional capability in order to provide a real credible threat against Soviet incursion. And this is part of Nitze's framework that really prizes collective security. And in order to be credible, you have to have the capability. It's not enough just to have the intent. The problem is, all this stuff costs a lot of money. And so NSC 68 comes up with this budget forecast that's going to about quadruple the defense budget. And when they submit this to President Truman, it's a dead letter. Because one of the things that Truman really wanted to do is decrease defense spending. He's a fiscal conservative. He wants to get it below $15 billion, maybe $14 billion. His Secretary of Defense, Lewis Johnson, kind of plays a name that tune game. He can go even lower than Truman. And so you see this trend of eroding defense resources, and then here comes Paul Nitze. Well, let's don't just keep it where it is, let's quadruple it. That is not going to happen in the Truman administration. So in the early months of 1950, you've got an option to change, but it's really not viable. And we also see this muddled thinking in 1950 with Secretary of State Dean Acheson when he's asked to give an understanding or a definition of the U.S. strategic perimeter. So sure, Japan's definitely within it. Japan is an existential national interest to the United States. If it's threatened, the United States would have to act. But Korea, not really. Taiwan, not really. Those things are in the periphery. Those aren't part of the strategic perimeter of the United States. Now, in hindsight, what people are going to argue is Acheson's speech or characterization of the location of Korea as far as the U.S. strategic interest is the thing that gives the green light for Stalin. And I think it's more important to look at this as evidence of this confused or evolving thinking in U.S. policy. Because What's going to happen is you're going to move from generics, from general discussions, to specifics with the invasion of the North Korea People's Army into the Republic of Korea. And we're going to see that that's the catalyst that the Soviet nuclear weapon, the Czechoslovakian coup, and the Chinese failure, or the nationalist failure in China, those aren't the catalyst for this radical change that we'll see in defense policy and in domestic policy. When the war starts, one of the more notable changes is going to be integration. Now, Truman desegregated the Department of Defense in 1948. However, the Army's dragging its feet in implementing this. The Navy and the Air Force a little bit more aggressive, but when the war starts, you still have a lot of desegregated combat units. And that's just ineffective. It's also an inefficient use of manpower. And one of the things that's evident in the early stages of the war is you need a lot of folks to fight. And in order to help fill the ranks, you're going to have to desegregate. But what it shows is the reasons why senior leaders in the Army were hesitant to do it said a lot more about them than about the capability of black soldiers. When black soldiers are given the opportunity, when they're given the resources, when they're given the responsibility, they more than meet the task. What's indicative of this cultural change, or the problems that black soldiers still encountered, is in the 25th Infantry Division, at the end of the war, black soldiers make up about 28% of the division, but they're going to make over 80% of the UCMJ indictments and over 98% of the UCMJ convictions. And so what happens with this integration is it's effective on the battlefield, but it's indicative of a larger struggle. And it is a continuation of the double V campaign that blacks wage in World War II, where you show your patriotism, you defend the nation, and hope that that has some crossover carryover to civil rights in the United States. That's still frustrated throughout the late part of the 1940s. There's hope that this can redouble that effort, and this leads to more activism in the 1950s for the civil rights movement. Another implication domestically is the acceptance of conscription. There had been a peacetime conscription in 1948, but that's largely to funnel occupation forces. The Korean War requires an expanded conscription program and moving folks from occupation, moving them into combat roles. And this is okay when the war seems to be going well, but for most of the war, it's going to be a stalemate. And people are increasingly skeptical and doubtful about conscription. But what's interesting is conscription is going to continue until 1973. So it took a brief pause after World War II, comes in a small manner in 1948, and then is expanded in the Korean War and is going to continue that expansion throughout the rest of the Cold War, through 1973. And that conscription is where we get MASH. So MASH, those doctors are part of the doctor draft, and it happens to quite a number of them. They had gone through med school in World War II. Some of them had actually deployed at the end of the war, but maybe they didn't have enough points. And then they get a letter from Uncle Sam in the Korean War saying, we understand you have a practice, we understand you have a family, but you still owe Uncle Sam for med school. So come on over. And you didn't get offered a career. This is not a career change. There's an understanding that you're going to be an Army doctor, but once the conflict's over, we're going to get you back. But your practice is already destroyed. There's increased stress on your family. You can understand why they're a little disaffected. But again, it shows this difference with conscription. Not to say there weren't frustrations in World War II, but the war seems to be accomplishing something. By the end of the Korean War, there's a little bit more frustration about what does this war accomplish. Another aspect domestically is the acceptance of limited war. And this is quite a change. In our national conversation, we think about wars much more in a total sense, that the nation's going to fight. That's World War II, the archetype of war. World War I, we're going to have mobilization, mass mobilization. Industry's going to get behind the effort. Korea is kind of neither fish nor fowl. There's enough mobilization for conscription. There's enough mobilization to have an industrial mobilization committee that you mobilize some aspects of the national production infrastructure, but you're not going to stop consumer production. In fact, the Truman administration wants to kind of overlay this war production capacity on top of consumer production. And they make a lot of hay about the fact that in 1951, the United States produces more cars during wartime for the consumer market than they made in 1948. So it seems like maybe the economy can do guns and butter. Not perfectly, but it's possible in a way that in World War II, it didn't seem possible, or in the immediate post-war period, it didn't quite seem possible. And this idea of limited war is also indicative in how the Truman administration characterizes this conflict. It's a police action. He's got the opportunity to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, but makes a conscious decision not to. Part of that's because he didn't want to go up on the Hill and argue for it, although there was bipartisan support for it. Another reason is because the United Nations Security Council offers the validation for it. This is a United Nations mission. The United States is a signatory to the United Nations, so they've given it its blessing. We're simply helping an organization that we are a part of. And that idea that the president's got very broad authority to deploy troops without a declaration of war in Congress is going to be something that becomes much more prevalent after the Korean War than before the Korean War, as far as large-scale conflicts. Because the last time that Congress declares war is 1942. So for the conflicts that we'll see for Korea and afterwards, there's no declaration of war. It also militarizes the Cold War in a way that Kennan argued would really precipitate the type of conflict that he did not want and he felt like the United States didn't want. And what's interesting about this militarization of the Cold War is it starts to challenge some of the assumptions that the Truman administration had in the late 1940s. It clarifies the type of threat for policymakers. Not to say that this is true, but it's true for Truman, it's true for policymakers at the time. And one of those is you see Stalin and Mao together. Now, in the early stages of the war, the United States, United Nations forces are pushed down to the Pusan perimeter, but then MacArthur's able to land at Incheon, break out of the perimeter, and go not only to the 38th, but push all the way to the Yalu. And it seems like maybe the United States can win war after all. That may got to shake the dust off of things, but we're okay. But then the Chinese enter the conflict. And all of a sudden, you're back down south of the 38th. And you're going to fight just to get back to the parallel, and that's where it's going to stay for almost 2 years as you try to figure out how do you end this war. But for Truman, for folks looking at this, what it's evidence of is this idea of monolithic communism. In the late 1940s, there are folks in the State Department who think there's actually some daylight between what Mao wants and what Stalin wants, and that maybe the United States can play Mao off of what Stalin wants in ways of benefiting the United States. Kind of a détente, but 30 years early. Once the Chinese come into the Korean War, that monolithic view of communism is going to be the predominant paradigm for interpreting the Cold War until Nixon and détente. Because it seems like Stalin is not just the supplier of arms, but he's also the director of all of these disparate communist movements. And really the threat is in Moscow. And so now you have to figure out, is this a feint? Is the real threat somewhere else? And so what we'll see is not only mobilization to deploy to fight in Korea, but also mobilization to deploy to Europe. The United States signs the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, but there's really not much political will or capital for the Truman administration to spend to get 4 army divisions to Europe to provide the core and the beginning of a NATO military infrastructure. But with the Korean War, that has to happen because maybe this is a feint. maybe the real threat is going to be in Europe, and if the United States isn't proactive, it can lose not only in Asia, but also lose in Europe, where most of the concentration is going to be, as far as U.S. national interests. Another thing that this war implicates, or this war impacts, is the understanding about what type of military you need to fight this war. Because the Chinese are going to come in with conventional light infantry forces and tactics. They're not coming in with mechanized forces. They're definitely not atomic in character. And so it lays open this assumption that really strategic deterrence, atomic deterrence, was the thing the United States needed to concentrate on. Don't worry about the conventional aspect, because atomic weapons will answer that as well. But what this shows is you unfortunately have to do both. That war in the atomic age is going to be conventional, but you also have to maintain a strategic nuclear deterrence as well. So you see again Paul Nitz's awkward framing that you got to do both, even though it's incredibly expensive. That's now an accepted reality. Another accepted reality is this idea of perimeter containment. Remember, Dean Acheson, before the war, says that Korea is a peripheral area. It's not of U.S. vital interest. It's easy to say that when you're not called to back it up. When you actually have to make the decision, it's not really about Korea, or it's not only about Korea. If you abandon Korea, what message are you sending to European allies that you just signed a treaty with? You're asking them to wonder, are they on one side of this line? Are they on the peripheral interest side that's okay to be captured, okay to be overrun? Or are they safe within the U.S. vital national interest side? And this gets to that idea of perimeter containment, but also to prestige, which is another foundational idea of NSC 68, that the United States has to husband and marshal its prestige as a security guarantor in order to be effective at building a collective security network. It's not enough to offer these treaties. You have to be dependable. And in order to be dependable, that means you have to answer the call of any state that you back, any state that you guarantee the territorial integrity of, even if it seems like a peripheral conflict. And so before the Korean War, it's not really clear that that is U.S. policy. After the Korean War, it is. That's what the United States has to do. When we look at this understanding of how this shapes U.S. policy, what's interesting is the enduring character of it. Because it's one thing to say, for a time, the U.S. increases its defense spending, increases its defense infrastructure, and then goes back to a peacetime construct. But in point of fact, what happens is this is going to stay relatively consistent. This is billions of dollars and held constant in fiscal year 2005 dollars. So a little bit of inflation since 2005 to 2022, but it kind of gets us in the ballpark of holding a constant. And what you can see is in the beginning of the graph, fiscal year 1940, just before World War II, defense outlays are rock bottom. Obviously, they spike for World War II. There's a rapid mobilization of the nation to fund defense. And then you kind of go back to normal. The United States doesn't retreat completely into a fortress America, but it's occupying. It's not worried as much about combat readiness. The Korean War, though, is different. Because what the Korean War is going to clarify is the United States has global interest, which World War II makes that evident. But what Korea does is make it clear that it requires forward deployed military forces. And in order to maintain that forward deployment, the United States has to keep a relatively large standing army for the first time in its history. Before the Korean War, you've got that normal ebb and flow. When it's peacetime, the Army is a very small organization that society largely forgets. In wartime, though, you're going to build it up, you're going to fight, and then after the war's over, you're going to get back to business and cut the military. You don't see that after the Korean War. There are going to be different interpretations about how much of a conventional capability do you need compared to how much atomic capability do you need. But it's always going to be the case that you'll have a relatively large standing army. And that's true today. You'll also have this relatively large standing army globally deployed. Again, there are going to be different variants as far as, do we have 2 corps in Europe? Well, not anymore, but we still have a 4-star headquarters in Europe. We still have Army land component, a 3-star headquarters there. We still have brigades deployed to Europe. We still have forces in Korea, still have forces in Japan, and forces now in Africa. So you can see this military characteristic of forward deployed forces, although not used to contain, but still used because the United States has global military responsibility and global interest. That is a product of the Korean War and an enduring one. The characteristic of conventional and atomic deterrent is still something that we're grappling with. While we've moved past the Cold War, we haven't moved past the atomic age. And in fact, Russia of late is making more overt rhetoric about the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons, and it's unclear exactly what the escalatory risk of that could be. But it shows that even in the 21st century, although we're out of the Cold War paradigm, this necessity of atomic deterrence is still important. But you also have to have conventional deterrence, because when you look at the conflict in Ukraine, it's not one that is atomic in character. It's very conventional. And in fact, U.S. experience in the 21st century is conventional, even if counterinsurgency. And so this necessity to fund both a conventional deterrent as well as a strategic deterrent is something that continues to endure after the Korean War. I think it's important to understand the implications of this war, because if we don't understand why we have the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, why that has a military bent, why that is an enduring element of U.S. foreign policy, then we can easily discard its usefulness or discard its importance. And what understanding the Korean War allows us to do is better understand the context that creates some of these enduring realities. We just take for granted that we can wage limited war for 20 years and still continue to have consumer production. We take it for granted that the president can deploy forces without a declaration of war from Congress. Those things are atypical prior to the Korean War, at least in terms of large-scale ground force deployments. But those are things that we just take for granted now. If we don't understand the conflicts that shape our present, then all too often we can think of things as rootless or as just existing now with really no connection to deeper historical events. And by better understanding the context that influenced and created these things, we can have a more fruitful discussion, I think a more well-informed discussion about why these institutions and these frameworks are important. Thank you.
Gates, first of all, I enjoyed your presentation very much. My question is really about this. I'm going to invite you to reflect further on the Reagan BuildUp on your chart here, you show
Yeah.
for every war there's a sharp increase of the budget, except in the Reagan buildup, there's no war. There's a buildup without a war, and in fact, the Cold War ends shortly after.
Yeah.
And so I was just wondering if you would like to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So I think with the Reagan buildup, like you said, there's no war, but you do have a redoubling of building up conventional power. Also, you've got strategic defense initiative that is incredibly expensive as well. Some of this, I think, it's called the Reagan buildup, but it's also kind of a Carter buildup, because after Vietnam, the U.S. Army is looking at its own institution, its own platforms, its own doctrine, and realizing that it's out of step with the contemporary capabilities of the Warsaw Pact. And that Reagan buildup is getting past that Vietnam era set of equipment and then getting into the Army, the big five things that the Army still uses today, the Bradley and the Abrams, the Black Hawk. Those are all part of that Reagan buildup, as well as things like strategic deterrent with strategic defense initiative and other investments in nuclear deterrent.
Gates, great talk. Pairing up with what Tom just asked a minute ago, you had this guy, Andrew Marshall, back in the early 80s, late 70s. I mean, he was around for a long time. The idea of competitive strategies, the P-2 Pershing missiles, the ground launch cruise missiles, and actually I think we bankrupted the Soviet Union about that time and almost bankrupted ourselves.
Well, it's when we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, it's a little bit like Hemingway when he discusses bankruptcy, right? Slowly and then all of a sudden. It's easy to see in hindsight some of those leading indicators, but I think it's important to understand during this Reagan buildup in the 80s, there aren't a lot of voices talking about spending the Soviets into oblivion, because the Soviets seem to have a pretty capable defense force, and we're doing this to try to catch up with them and hopefully offer some offset to them. Now, after the fact, like you said, when you start to see behind the curtain and realize there's bluster, there's rhetoric, and then there's reality, I think that's not known when they're going through refurbishing the U.S. Army after the Vietnam War.
This will cause you to speculate a bit, but
Uh-oh.
what are the policy implications of our more recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Well, what's different between them and the Korean War? The Korean War ends in a way that is unsatisfactory, but continues, or at least that military commitment endures for decades in the case of Korea, but also in the case of NATO and European forward deployment. What's different with Iraq and Afghanistan is the military commitment, obviously, in Afghanistan does not endure. And the commitment in Iraq takes a step back, and then we come back with the rise of ISIS and helping Iraq to fight them off. I think what's different is whereas Korea shows the importance of U.S. military involvement and military forward deployment for policymakers in the United States, that's something that they need to do and they need to continue to do. I think that that's had an opposite effect with Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a lot more skepticism about the necessity to keep U.S. forces globally deployed. It's a little bit more, I think it's a little bit more acceptable now given what's happening in Ukraine, but before this war between Russia and Ukraine, there was a lot of discussion about, well, what is the nature of forward deployment in the 21st century for the United States? What does that look like? How much do we need in Europe? How much do we need in other places? And I think that's the main difference between Iraq and Afghanistan, is it raises a lot more skepticism, whereas Korea has the opposite effect. Korea instills the necessity for forward deployment. Is that?
Hey, Gates, you mentioned that the U.S. obviously hasn't declared war since World War II, but in Korea, as you pointed out, we tend to forget this was a United Nations war. The United Nations declared war. It's a United Nations force, not strictly a U.S. force. So did the UN declaration of war and the multinational coalition with the name United Nations, led by the United States, did that create any kind of precedent kind of in international relations or within the UN itself, or was it just kind of a one-off?
Well, I think that the United Nations Security Council is still seen as a legitimizing force for involvement. And so with the 2003 invasion, that's the first place that the United States tries to go is, hey, we got to get the imprimatur from the Security Council. If we can get that, then okay, we may not need to go through all these other wickets, but then that doesn't happen, and we get a coalition of the willing to support, and that causes a lot of frustration in the international community, that if the Security Council is the arbiter of these things, then it should be the arbiter of that. And if it's just a rubber stamp, then maybe the United States should be a little bit more careful about these things. I think what's interesting is how the Security Council gets the approval in Korea, and that is, the Soviets are boycotting. You're right, they're not there. They're boycotting the non-recognition of the People's Republic of China by the United States, and so they absent themselves from the Security Council, and the United States is able to kind of steal a march in that way and get the Security Council to agree that this is an injustice that can't stand. We're going to sanction military action, and the United States, of course, happens to have a guy without a job, needs to do something, MacArthur, and we get forces. So you said it's not a unilateral action, but it is a majority U.S. action.
Oh, thank you. Just show the difference in terms of, say, basically the enlisted level, during that right after Korea, and then what it was in the Vietnam War. When I got in the National Guard here, in the early 50s, you didn't get new clothes. You had to sign out for your clothes, and they were always used clothes and used boots and everything else. You didn't get new things. But then I got out after I had my 8 years of service, and then I got back in 75, 76, and I joined up. Everything was new, and they didn't give a damn where you gave it back when your time was up or not. So that was just a total difference of what Eisenhower looked at as spending on military. And we squeezed at the lower level.
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about Eisenhower, he's definitely trying to rein in this defense spending, but he's not going to take it down to post-World War II level. And while the Army may be given short shrift under Eisenhower's budgets, the Air Force and the Navy aren't necessarily. And so maybe, you join the Air National Guard and maybe things are different. But the Army is not seen as important under Eisenhower. And then, of course, Kennedy will. And that's why this different interpretations about how much conventional capability as opposed to strategic capability, but nobody is saying, well, let's just cut conventional capability almost to the bone because we have strategic capability. That's why I think the difference with the Korean War, but like you said, in the Army in the 1950s, it's a tough row under Eisenhower.
You've been talking about the defense policy implications of the Korean War in terms of Cold War dynamics. What I want to ask is whether the unique operational dynamics of the Korean War affected defense policy very much. In other words, in World War II, you have kind of maneuver war in Western Europe. You have naval and air warfare in the Pacific. In the Korean War, when the thing settles down, you get position warfare that's more like World War I. You get dueling trench lines that don't move very much for years. It's different from most of what you see in World War II in Europe or the Pacific. And it's also different from what you would see later in Vietnam, which has still, again, very different operational dynamics. But I wondered if the unique operational dynamics affected the Cold War defense policies very much.
To a degree, one of the things that's most impactful for the Korean War is its conventional character. So, like you said, it's a lot of positional warfare once you get into that stalemate period, but it's conventional. And even though Truman has some discussions, although very vaguely, about do you keep it conventional, maybe you go atomic. Eisenhower's a little bit more overt. Chinese, Soviets, if you're not open to some movement in negotiations, we may not be able to keep it a conventional conflict for long. But that conventional character of the conflict is something that's going to show the necessity to have a conventional capability. In terms of doctrine, when the war starts, the United States understands to a degree that its armor platforms and its anti-armor platforms maybe aren't quite up to snuff. And so you're going to see some redoubling of those efforts. There's some updating of doctrine, but it's a little bit more kind of characterized. How do you understand these new capabilities in light of what you learned with the maneuver warfare in World War II? Korea's not a great tank country, but it's not taken as a given that every war after Korea will be in maneuver unfriendly terrain or maneuver inhibiting terrain. And so I don't think that there's as much as far as closing off discussions about the importance of maneuver. If anything, what Korea does for advocates of maneuver warfare is it shows the problems of the lack of maneuver. That when you get into a situation where you can't maneuver, you're probably more likely to have a longer attritional campaign. And while the United States can send a bullet instead of sending a person, it's still expensive. You're still sacrificing some people, maybe not to the same ratio as your enemies, but it's distasteful. It doesn't resonate well with the population. And so for the Army, this is not seen as something that you want to emulate necessarily. You want to capture that in doctrine, but you don't take it as a given that the next war is going to be a positional war. You kind of hopefully get away from that and show the value of maneuver, that it maybe can offer decisiveness, whereas positional warfare can lead to stalemate.
Well, I was sitting here listening to what you were saying, and I got to thinking. One of the things that happened during the 1973 era was you had the Arab-Israeli War, and there were a lot of things that came out of that woke up the United States Army. And I think that's got some, especially in the chemical realm, Sagar anti-tank missiles, although we had TOW missiles even in the Vietnam War. But, I mean, it really was a wake-up call, which is almost worth talking about in a discussion of the 80-year period that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and that is true. The 73 goes back to what you were saying about the operational specifics. 73 offers a lot more grist for the mill as far as doctrinal either clarification or doctrinal influence, depending on how you view that war. Whereas Korea, it shows that this conflict, if you got to fight somebody like the Chinese, it's going to be tough because they're just going to overwhelm you with numbers. So how do you combat that numerical asymmetric advantage? More effective firepower, more effective deployment of that firepower. So you're going to use a lot of indirect fire. You're going to use a lot of small arms, but you're not going to use human waves in the way that the enemy is. And so that's, I think, some of the difference. Whereas post-73, the Army looks at this and says you've got a doctrinal imbalance. What happens with Korea is it's not as much a doctrinal imbalance as if we're going to fight folks that use a human wave tactics, what we have to do is make sure that we can compensate with that with overwhelming firepower, which is something the United States is comfortable with. All right. Thank you. I've got... So next month will be Dr. Kalick, who will talk about espionage in the Cold War, and that's 3 November. And then we also have some podcasts for the Department of Military History. Our Broad Gauge Gossip is our faculty introduction, and then Confused Heap of Facts is a little bit more in-depth the faculty gives us an opportunity to talk about research projects. There's also some student panel podcast episodes, and then we also have a Facebook page. So please keep tabs with us and keep connected. Thank you very much.